I used to think, before I could even dream of like actually speaking another language, I had to have this huge, massive vocabulary like memorized. Like I was prepping for some kind of, I don't know, like verbal obstacle course or something. Turns out that's just like one of those things, one of those myths, one of those language learning myths that we're going to unpack today, right?
It's a really common one for sure. And it's interesting because the research actually points us in a slightly different direction. It's less about the sheer number of words and more about understanding, like that basic conversational flow. And those all important social cues, especially when you're first starting to communicate in a new language.
So are you saying instead of like panicking over memorizing every single word,
Right.
we should really be focusing on how conversations actually work, like in that language, almost like learning the dance before worrying about nailing every single step.
That's a great analogy. Think about it. Even if you only know a handful of words, right? Being able to say please and thank you at the right time, or to ask, how do you say, who? That goes such a long way. It shows respect. And it helps you get your point across, even with limited vocabulary.
Yeah, and it shows them that you understand the etiquette, even if your like vocabulary is still a work in progress. So
Mm.
I can definitely see how that would just make those first conversations feel a lot less intimidating. But let's talk about grammar for a second. Because I don't know about you, but for years I felt like I was stuck on this like language learning ladder,
Mm.
where I was like tackling one grammar rule at a time. Is that really the best way to learn though?
That whole grammar ladder image, it's another one of those persistent myths. Language learning, it isn't linear. It's so much more about, it's kind of like, I think of it like assembling a jigsaw puzzle. You're always fitting in new pieces, and sometimes you even have to rearrange them as your understanding grows.
So instead of being discouraged when we have to like revisit a grammar rule that we thought we already knew,
Hmm.
we should actually see that as a good sign, as a sign of progress.
Exactly. It's like embrace those moments of relearning. Maybe even keep a language learning journal and actually jot down those times when you're like, oh, I get it now.
Mm. When you find yourself understanding something that you struggled with before, it's a great way to actually track your progress.
That's a really helpful tip. I'm already thinking about like all the ways that how differently I would have approached this if I'd known. Now this whole idea of grammar being linear, it makes me think about another myth that I feel like I hear pretty often. And that's this idea that learners need to be kind of shielded from complex grammar until they've like mastered the basics. Yeah, that's definitely another one that needs to go. It's like saying you can only learn to cook if you master boiling water first. And then you can move on to like sautéing or baking, right? You need to experience all of it, the interplay of all these techniques to really get cooking, or, in this case, to get language. So exposing learners to a variety of structures, even the complex ones, it's actually super beneficial.
So you were saying it's okay to like throw in a subjunctive clause or two, even if they're still kind of getting a handle on their present tense verbs.
Well, think about it. Even babies, right? When they're learning their first language, they're exposed to all kinds of complex structures from day one. What helps them make sense of it all is this amazing thing called modified interaction.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. Tell me more about this modified interaction.
So basically, it's how we, as native speakers, naturally adjust our language to make it easier for learners to understand. Like, think about how a parent might talk to a child.
Hmm.
Simpler words, more repetition, maybe even like exaggerated tones. And this modified interaction, it helps the child crack the code, so to speak. And the same principle applies when you're learning a new language as an adult.
So it's like they're scaffolding the language,
Yeah.
but without like dumbing it down,
Yeah.
which is something I feel like we kind of get wrong sometimes
Yeah.
in more formal learning environments.
Absolutely. That's often where classrooms can kind of miss the mark a little bit. It's so important to make sure learners are exposed to a variety of structures, not just the so-called simple ones, and to provide that supportive interaction that really mirrors that natural language acquisition process.
So it's about creating this rich linguistic ecosystem, much like what we encounter in the real world. And speaking of real world language learning, let's talk about mistakes for a minute, because we've all been there, right?
Mm.
Where that fear of making a mistake can be like a major roadblock.
Absolutely, and it's so common. There's this anxiety that surrounds making errors, this idea that they're somehow detrimental to the learning process. But honestly, making mistakes, it's not only natural, it's essential. It's how we learn and grow.
I'm so glad you said that. It's like you can't make an omelet without cracking a few eggs, right?
Exactly. Errors they're just a natural part of the process. It's how our brains figure things out.
So instead of freaking out about every little mistake, we should really be looking at them as, like, these little opportunities.
Exactly. They're like giving us a peek into how your brain is processing the language. Now, of course, if someone is consistently making the same error, especially if it's a common error among multiple learners, then it might be worth addressing. But constantly correcting every little thing, that can be really demotivating.
It's about finding that balance, right, between giving learners the space to kind of freely explore the language and then offering guidance when it's really needed. So it sounds like when it comes to feedback, there's not really a one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. Feedback should always be tailored to the learner's level, their learning style, and the situation. Patience and encouragement, those are key.
I love that. Patience and encouragement. Because everyone's different, right? Everyone learns at their own pace. Okay, so we've tackled a few big myths already. We've talked about the vocabulary myth, the grammar ladder, simple structures, fear of making mistakes. But we've got plenty more to unpack. This deep dive is turning out to be quite the adventure, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. We're just getting started. So much to dive into. Speaking of diving in, you know how we were talking about using like authentic materials? I've heard some teachers say they only want to use materials that students have, quote unquote, mastered, almost like they're trying to protect them from anything too challenging. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's like that idea of only staying in the shallow end of the pool when you're learning to swim. You're never going to really learn how to swim unless you get in the deep end, right?
That's such a good way to put it because while it's important to practice specific skills, if all you're exposed to are those like carefully curated textbook dialogues, how are you ever going to be ready for the real world?
So you were saying that we should be, like, throwing learners into the linguistic deep end. Like, should we be handing them Dostoevsky when they're still, trying to figure out their verb conjugations?
Okay, let's not get carried away. Ha ha. It's not about overwhelming anyone. It's more about gradually introducing them to things that resemble the real world, Like, think, news articles, song lyrics, even just like a menu. All of those can be really great learning tools.
Because it's about building those muscles.
Right.
Learning how to navigate the nuances.
Exactly. It's the difference between reading about a culture and actually experiencing it.
Totally. So speaking of different approaches, what about group work? I know some people worry that it just turns into everyone copying each other's mistakes.
Right. Oh, that's definitely another myth that needs to be like totally debunked. Group activities, when they're done well, they can be incredibly helpful. Think about it. It's a chance for learners to practice speaking more freely. And it's fun learning with other people. There's a sense of community there.
So it's not like one person's mistake is going to spread through the group like a cold or something.
Not at all. In fact, research shows that learners often don't make more errors when they're working together. They can actually learn a lot from each other. It's an opportunity to, misunderstandings happen. But then you clarify them together, you try out phrases, you get that instant feedback.
It's like having a built-in support system. Now, I do want to talk about the role of the teacher in all of this, because sometimes there's this pressure, this expectation that the teacher is responsible for everything a student learns.
Right, and that's a lot to put on someone. It's crucial to remember that learners, they don't learn in a vacuum. It's not just about direct instruction from the teacher. They pick things up from everywhere all the time.
It's like they're always on.
Yeah. Yes. They're constantly absorbing information, figuring out the patterns, even, outside of the classroom.
Which actually reminds me of another myth, that it's better to just rephrase a learner's mistake than to actually correct it directly. Have you heard of this?
Oh, absolutely. That's called recasting. And while it definitely has its place, it's not always the best strategy.
Because if you just keep rephrasing, how do they even know they made a mistake?
Exactly. And studies have actually shown that sometimes learners don't always interpret that as a correction.
It's like we're accidentally giving them the wrong answer on a math problem, and they just don't know any better.
That's a good way to think about it. Explicit feedback, when it's done sensitively and at the right time, of course, it can actually be much more effective.
So it's that balance again, right?
Always. Now, before we've got a little more time, I wanted to quickly address one more myth. This one comes up a lot, especially when we're talking about learning a language in context.
You mean like learning other subjects, like in your target language?
Exactly. Some people think it's just too much.
Too much to handle.
Right. But you know what? The research actually says otherwise.
Wait, so you're telling me that learning about, say, history, learning about history in, let's say, Spanish, could actually be good for my Spanish skills.
You got it. It's called content-based instruction, and it's been shown to be super effective.
Okay, that's blowing my mind a little.
Yeah.
Because it makes sense when you think about it, right? It's like you're learning about something interesting, and you're picking up the language at the same time.
Exactly. And there's research to back it up. It's great for comprehension skills, for building your vocabulary.
So it really is like hitting two birds with one stone.
Yeah.
But I do have to ask, does that mean that learners will, like, magically become grammatically perfect just by, studying history or science in another language?
It's a great question. And not necessarily. It's not a magic solution. There might still be some need for, dedicated grammar practice.
Right. It all comes back to balance, doesn't it?
It always does. Language learning is so personal. What works for one person won't necessarily work for another.
Wow. I feel like we've given our listeners so much to think about today.
Yeah, it's been a really, really rich conversation.
And I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
Right. Language learning it's an endless journey.
So if we had to boil down everything that we talked about today into like one main takeaway, one big idea, what would it be?
That's a good question. I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no right answer. When it comes to language learning, that is. Everyone's different. Every learner is unique.
No magic formula.
Exactly. And that's okay. It's about enjoying the process, embracing those aha moments, and being patient with yourself along the way.
Speaking of, what would you say to our listeners who are, maybe feeling inspired to start a new language or pick back up one that they kind of put on the back burner?
Don't be afraid to just go for it. Find what works for you, explore different methods, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how you learn.
Couldn't agree more. It's all about the journey, right?
Absolutely.
And it's about connecting with other cultures.
Exactly. Opening yourself up to new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing the world.
That's what it's all about. Well, on that note, we'd love to hear from you, our amazing listeners. What are some language learning myths that you've encountered? Let us know. And until next time, happy learning, everyone.